The first sign that something was wrong did not come from a battlefield, or a diplomatic channel, or even a sensor array. It came from silence. Not the normal kind, the quiet between transmissions, the expected lull between fleets moving through empty space. This silence spread. To move. It consumed entire regions of monitored space with a precision that no natural phenomenon could replicate, and yet it left no debris, no radiation, no trace of conflict behind it. Stations went dark without distress calls. Relay nodes failed without system errors. Entire observation grids simply stopped reporting. At first, the Directorate dismissed it as coincidence. Minor disruptions. Routine maintenance lapses. Even the most advanced network, spanning tens of thousands of systems, could experience fluctuations. That was the official position. It held for exactly 9 hours. Because in the 10th hour, the silence reached a system that was not supposed to fail. A core surveillance hub, one of the oldest, most secure installations ever constructed, blinked out of existence without so much as a flicker of warning. Its final transmission was not a distress signal. It was not a log entry. It was not even a malfunction report. It was a timestamp. Nothing else. That was when the first question emerged, quiet and unwelcome. Who had the ability to touch something like that, without being seen? High Observer Kaylee's Varn did not like questions that did not have immediate answers. He stood alone in the central chamber of the Directorate's monitoring spire, watching a three-dimensional projection of the network ripple in slow, shifting currents of light. Thousands of nodes pulsed in coordinated rhythm, each one representing a system under the Directorate's protection, guidance, and control. Except now, some of those lights were gone. Not dimmed. Not damaged. Gone. Erased so cleanly that the system did not even register them as failures. It simply recalculated the network as if those nodes had never existed at all. Kaylee's narrowed his eyes slightly, a subtle movement that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who did not know him for centuries. "Run the reconstruction algorithm again," he said, his voice calm, measured, and utterly devoid of concern. The system obeyed instantly. The projection shifted. Data cascaded through layers of analysis, reconstructing historical logs, cross-referencing redundancies, rebuilding what had been lost. And then it stopped. The missing nodes did not return. They did not exist in the system's memory anymore. That was not a failure. That was removal. Kaylee's felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the surface of his composure. It was not fear. Not yet. It was irritation. Because something, somewhere, had just reached into the most controlled, most stable system in the galaxy, and rewritten it. Without permission. Without detection. Without leaving a trace. He turned slightly, his gaze settling on a secondary display that tracked a far less important region of space. A quiet sector. Recently integrated. Barely worth attention. A yellow star, 8 planets, scattered debris fields, and a young species that had, quite sensibly, accepted their place within the Directorate structure without resistance. Humanity. They had been predictable. Cooperative. Compliant. They had accepted the limitations imposed on them. Reduced expansion. Restricted research. Full transparency across all communications. Their fleets had been catalogued, monitored, and, if necessary, containable. They had done everything correctly. Which was precisely why Kaylee's found himself staring at their system longer than necessary. Because the silence had not touched it. Not directly. Not yet. But the pattern, subtle, almost invisible, curved around it. As if something was avoiding it. Or worse. As if something was using it. Kaylee's inhaled slowly, the motion almost ceremonial, and for the first time since the anomalies began, he allowed himself to consider a possibility that the Directorate had spent 40,000 years eliminating from its calculations. What if this was not a failure of the system? What if this was the system being studied? A new data point flickered into existence. A transmission log from the Sol system. Time-stamped 12 minutes before the first node went dark. Kaylee's expanded it. The contents were empty. No message. No data packet. No encoded signal. Just a confirmation of outbound transmission. Destination, unknown. He stared at it for a long moment, his thoughts aligning, rearranging, rejecting conclusions that refused to stay buried. Humanity had accepted everything. Every restriction. Every limitation. Every condition designed to ensure they would never become a threat. They had not resisted. They had not questioned. They had not even hesitated. And now, across the galaxy, the Directorate's network was beginning to disappear in perfect, deliberate silence. Kayleigh exhaled slowly. "Trace the origin," he said. The system paused. Then, for the first time in its recorded history, it responded with a delay. Unable to comply. The chamber fell into absolute stillness. Kayleigh did not move. But inside his mind, something shifted. Because in all the time the Directorate had ruled, in all the civilizations it had guided, contained, or erased, there had never been a moment when the system could not answer. Until now. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of their sensors, something had just asked a question the Directorate did not know how to respond to. The only problem was, humanity had stopped asking questions 7 days ago. So why did it suddenly feel like they had just started answering them? The Directorate did not panic. It had outlived panic. For 40,000 years, it had refined uncertainty into procedure, transformed anomalies into data points, and reduced entire civilizations to manageable variables. There was a process for everything, including the unexpected. But there was no process for absence. Kayleigh Varn remained in the monitoring chamber long after the initial reports had stabilized, watching as the projection recalibrated itself again and again, each iteration confirming the same impossible truth. The missing nodes were not malfunctioning. They were not hidden. They were not damaged. They had been removed from existence as far as the system was concerned. The Directorate's greatest strength had always been its memory. Every action, every development, every deviation was recorded, catalogued, and analyzed. Nothing was ever truly lost. Except now, something was. And worse, the system was adapting to that loss as if it had always been correct. "Begin historical deviation mapping," Kayleigh ordered quietly. A secondary lattice of light unfolded across the projection, layering timelines over one another, highlighting discrepancies between recorded history and current system state. For a moment, everything appeared stable. Then the fractures began to show. Small at first. A delayed report here. A missing archival reference there. Minor inconsistencies that, individually, could be dismissed. But together, they formed a pattern that spread backward through time, rippling across centuries of recorded data. Kayleigh leaned forward slightly. The silence was not just consuming the present. It was rewriting the past. That realization should not have been possible. No known technology could retroactively alter recorded history on a network of this scale. Not even the Directorate's own systems possessed that level of control. Which meant only one thing. This was not an attack designed to destroy. It was designed to erase. Behind him, the chamber doors parted with a whisper of displaced air as another presence entered. Kayleigh did not turn. He already knew who it was. Archivist Elrven moved with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to observing rather than acting. Her role within the Directorate was simple in definition and immeasurable in importance. She was responsible for truth. Not the curated version presented to younger species. The real one. "The reports are accurate," she said without preamble, her voice calm but edged with something Kayleigh had not heard from her before. "Uncertainty. They are incomplete," Kayleigh replied. Elwire stepped closer, her gaze moving across the projection, absorbing the anomalies with unsettling speed. Incomplete implies missing data. This is replacement. Kayleigh finally turned to face her. "You've seen this before." It was not a question. Elwire hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. "Not like this," she admitted. "But the pattern is familiar." She extended a hand, and the projection shifted, isolating a cluster of systems deep within the Directorate's historical archives. Older records. Restricted ones. Kayleigh recognized them immediately. Integration cycles. Species that had once been identified as high-risk variables. Too adaptive, too innovative, too unpredictable to be allowed uncontrolled growth. The Directorate had offered them guidance. Limitations. structure. Every one of them had accepted. Eventually, LYR adjusted the display, overlaying their developmental trajectories. Each one followed the same pattern: rapid growth, sudden stabilization, long-term stagnation. 17 cases, she said quietly, all classified as successful integrations. Kaylee's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. And yet, he said, none of them progressed. OIR nodded once. That was the point. The words settled into the chamber with uncomfortable weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Kaylee's turned back to the projection, his focus returning to the present. Humanity accepted their integration terms without resistance, he said. Faster than any species on record. Yes, OIR replied. They reduced expansion. They halted weapons development. They opened their communications for full monitoring. Yes. They complied. OIR did not answer immediately this time. Instead, she adjusted the display again, isolating the Sol system. Human space. It appeared stable. Quiet. Exactly as expected. Too quiet. They complied, she repeated slowly, but they did not behave. Kaylee's gaze flicked toward her. Explain. LYR expanded the timeline surrounding humanity's integration. 7 days of data stretched across the display, each moment meticulously recorded, every action tracked. On the surface, everything aligned perfectly with Directorate expectations. No unauthorized expansion. No restricted research. No signs of military escalation. But beneath that surface, something else moved. A series of micro-deviations. Precise. Almost invisible. Energy fluctuations that did not correspond to known systems. Communication bursts too brief to be analyzed. Movements of civilian vessels that followed no logical pattern. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a question. What are they doing? Kaylee's asked. OIR's expression remained unreadable. That, she said, is the problem. She highlighted a specific point in the timeline. 12 minutes before the first node went dark. A transmission. Outbound. Origin, Sol. Destination, unknown. Kaylee's felt the irritation return, sharper this time. We cannot trace it, he said. I know. We cannot intercept it. I know. Then what can we do? For the first time since she entered the chamber, Elwar met his gaze directly. We can stop assuming they are contained. The words landed harder than they should have. Because containment was not just a strategy. It was the foundation of the Directorate's authority. Every species that had ever risen too quickly, grown too strong, or asked too many questions had been contained, controlled, integrated into a system that ensured stability. Humanity was supposed to be no different. And yet, 7 days after accepting every restriction imposed on them, they had done something no other species had ever accomplished. They had created a variable the Directorate could not measure. Kaylee's turned back to the projection, his mind already moving ahead, recalculating, adapting. Begin full-spectrum surveillance of the Sol system, he ordered. The system responded instantly. Already in progress. A new layer of data unfolded across the display, flooding the chamber with information. Every satellite, every vessel, every signal, every movement. For a moment, it was overwhelming in its completeness. Then Kaylee saw it. The gaps. Tiny at first. Then larger. Blind spots. Not errors. Not malfunctions. Deliberate absences. They're blocking us, he said quietly. LYR nodded. Yes. Kaylee's eyes narrowed. That's not possible. No, LYR agreed. It isn't. Another node went dark. Then another. The silence was accelerating now, spreading faster than before, moving with a purpose that was becoming harder to ignore. Kaylee's watched the projection shift, watched the network recalibrate, watched reality adjust itself around something it could not perceive. And for the first time in his existence, he considered a possibility that had never needed to be considered before. What if humanity had not accepted integration to survive? What if they had accepted it to get closer? Another alert flashed across the display. This one was different. Not a failure. Not an absence. A message. Incoming. Origin. Unknown. Kaylee's expanded it immediately. The contents resolved into a single line of text. No encryption. No signature. No identifiable source. Just a statement. We see you now. The chamber fell silent again. But this time, the silence felt different. Not empty. Not passive. Watching. Waiting. And somewhere, beyond the edges of the Directorate's understanding, something had just confirmed what Kaylee's was only beginning to suspect. Humanity had never been contained. They had been observing. The only question left was, what were they waiting for? The message should not have existed. That was the first conclusion Kaylee's Varn reached, and it was the only one that made sense, if sense still applied. The Directorate's network was not just secure, it was absolute. Every signal passed through layers of verification, every transmission filtered, cataloged, controlled. Nothing entered or exited without being seen, understood, and archived. And yet, the message had appeared. Not routed through the system. Not intercepted. Not even detected until it chose to reveal itself. We see you now. Kaylee's replayed it again, not because it contained more information, but because it contained too little. There was no metadata, no origin signature, no residual imprint that could be traced backward. It had not traveled through the network. It had simply been there. Is it a breach? He asked. HFY Ven did not answer immediately. Her attention was fixed on the projection, but not the message. She was looking at the spaces around it, the way a historian studies what has been removed rather than what remains. No, she said finally. A breach leaves damage. This leaves structure. Kaylee's turned to her. Structure? HFY adjusted the display, isolating the sequence of events surrounding the message. The disappearing nodes. The shifting timelines. The blind spots forming around Sol. The untraceable outbound transmission. She layered them together. The result was not chaos. It was alignment. A pattern, precise and deliberate, threading through every anomaly. This isn't interference, she continued. It's construction. The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Kaylee's felt his focus sharpen. Construction of what? HFY hesitated again, and this time the pause stretched longer than it should have. I don't know, she admitted. But whatever it is, it requires us not to see it. Another node went dark. Closer this time. Not in the outer regions, not in the forgotten systems where errors could hide unnoticed, but within a monitored corridor used by Directorate patrol fleets. A region that should have been saturated with redundant sensors. The projection recalculated. The node vanished. No alert. No failure report. Just absence. Kaylee stepped closer to the display, his gaze narrowing as he tracked the spread. The silence was no longer random. It was moving along specific pathways, tracing routes that connected key systems, bypassing others entirely. Avoiding some. Targeting others. Overlay traffic patterns, he ordered. The system complied. Lines of movement appeared across the projection, mapping trade routes, patrol circuits, communication relays. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then the pattern emerged. The silence followed the paths that information traveled. Not the routes of fleets. Not the positions of weapons. The routes of knowledge. Kaylee's felt something cold settle into place inside him. It's isolating us, he said. HFY nodded. Yes. From what? That depends, she replied, on what it doesn't want us to see. The implication was immediate and unsettling. If the Directorate was being isolated, then something existed outside its awareness that it was not meant to observe. Something that was already happening. Kaylee's turned back to the message. We see you now. Not a threat. Not a warning. A statement of fact. And it raised a far more dangerous question than any declaration of hostility ever could. How long had they been watching? Expand surveillance beyond the affected regions, Kaylee's ordered. I want independent verification from unaffected systems. The system responded instantly, deploying long-range observation protocols, cross-checking data from sectors untouched by the silence. For a moment, the projection stabilized. Then the discrepancies began. Small at first. A star that should have been emitting at a specific frequency wasn't. A station that should have reported 3 cycles ago hadn't. A fleet that should have arrived at its destination had no record of departure. Kaylee stared at the data, his mind racing through possibilities, rejecting each one as it failed to account for the scale. This was not localized. This was not contained. This was everywhere. We've been blind longer than we thought, R said quietly. Kaylee's did not respond. Because he was beginning to see it too. The silence was not expanding. It had already expanded. What they were witnessing now was not its growth. It was the moment they finally noticed. Another alert flashed across the display. This one different again. Not a missing node. Not a message. A discrepancy. Kaylee's isolated it. A system at the edge of Directorate space. Designation, Keeler Tutline. Status, active. Population, stable. Integration level, compliant. Everything about it appeared normal. Until the system cross-referenced it with historical records. Then the error appeared. Kirt 9 had been erased. 200 years ago. Kaylee's felt the first real fracture in his composure. Show me the archival record. The system hesitated. Then responded. Record unavailable. Unavailable? Kaylee's repeated, his voice sharper now. Data not found. That system does not exist, OR said quietly. Kaylee's turned to her. And yet it does, he replied. The projection showed it clearly. A fully functioning system. Active transmissions. Stable population. Integrated into the Directorate's network as if it had always been there. But the records that should have explained its existence were gone. Kaylee's thoughts aligned rapidly, pieces falling into place with a clarity that felt almost violent. If the silence erases, he said slowly, and something else replaces? OR finished the thought. Then we are not losing systems. Kaylee's looked back at the projection, at the lights that still remained, at the network he had trusted for centuries. We're being rewritten. The chamber seemed to contract around them, the weight of that realization pressing in from every direction. Because if reality itself could be altered at this scale, if entire systems could be removed and replaced without detection, then the Directorate's control was not just compromised. It was irrelevant. Another transmission appeared. Not from the unknown origin this time. From Seoul. Public. Unencrypted. Visible across the entire network. Kaylee's opened it without hesitation. The image resolved slowly, stabilizing into something unmistakably human. A figure. Still watching. For a brief moment, there was no sound. No movement. Just the quiet presence of someone who knew they were being observed. Then the figure spoke. Not loudly. Not with urgency. But with absolute certainty. You're looking in the wrong places. The transmission cut. Kaylee's did not move. OR did not speak. Because in that single sentence, humanity had done something no species had ever done before. They had not denied the Directorate's authority. They had not resisted it. They had simply stepped outside of it. And now, the silence was no longer the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. It was the part humanity had allowed them to see. The real question was, what existed where they weren't looking? The Directorate did not acknowledge fear. It categorized it, studied it, and eliminated its causes long before it could spread. Entire civilizations had been guided away from panic through carefully constructed narratives, their uncertainties dissolved into controlled truths that preserved stability across thousands of systems. But now, inside the core of that stability, something was fracturing. Not visibly. Not chaotically. Quietly. Which made it worse. Kaylee's Varn stood in the same position he had occupied since the first node vanished, but the chamber around him had changed. Additional projections now layered over the central display, streams of raw data bypassing standard filtration protocols, feeding directly into his analysis. This was no longer routine observation. This was containment of something that refused to be contained. Report, he said. The response came not from a single voice, but from multiple systems speaking in overlapping precision. 72 additional nodes unresponsive. Communication latency increasing across 8 sectors. Long-range surveillance returning inconsistent stellar readings. Civilian traffic patterns deviating beyond acceptable thresholds. Kaylee's processed each update without outward reaction, but internally, the pattern was becoming undeniable. The silence was accelerating. Not randomly. Not uncontrollably. Deliberately. Arven moved closer to the projection, her attention fixed on a series of highlighted regions that had begun to glow faintly along the outer edges of the network. "They're connecting," she said. Kaylee's followed her gaze. The isolated anomalies, once scattered and seemingly unrelated, were now forming lines. Pathways. Corridors of absence that stretched across systems, linking distant regions into a single, coherent structure. "What does it lead to?" he asked. Awire did not answer immediately. Instead, she expanded the projection further, pulling in data from deep archival layers, overlaying ancient maps of directorate expansion, early integration routes, and long-forgotten conflict zones. The alignment sharpened. And then, the destination revealed itself. Not a single system. Not a single location. A network. Hidden within the network. Kaylee's felt something shift again, deeper this time, something that did not belong to irritation or curiosity. Something closer to realization. "This isn't an attack," he said slowly. "No," Thor replied. "It's a separation." The words settled heavily between them. Because separation implied intent beyond destruction. It implied purpose. The Directorate had always maintained control by ensuring connectivity. Every system linked. Every species integrated. Every piece of information flowing through a centralized structure that could be monitored, adjusted, or restricted as needed. But now, something was carving out space within that structure. Not destroying it. Dividing it. Creating something independent. Another alert pulsed across the display, sharper than the others. Unauthorized fleet mobilization detected. Kaylee's turned toward the secondary projection. Multiple Directorate enforcement fleets were activating across different sectors, their movements coordinated with a speed that bypassed standard authorization chains. "That order did not come from this chamber," Kaylee said. "It didn't need to," Oer replied. "The system is responding." Kaylee's understood immediately. The Directorate's greatest strength had always been its ability to act without hesitation. Automated protocols ensured that threats were neutralized before they could escalate, that deviations were corrected before they could spread. But those protocols had been built on assumptions. Predictable threats. Measurable risks. Known variables. Humanity had just introduced something else. Unknown intent. And the system was reacting the only way it knew how. With force. Fleet designations appeared across the projection, each one representing a force capable of overwhelming entire systems within hours. Their trajectories converged toward the same region. "So, they're moving too early," Kaylee said. "They're moving blind," Thor corrected. Neither statement was reassuring. Because for the first time in its existence, the Directorate was deploying its full power without understanding what it was facing. And that was exactly the kind of mistake it had spent 40,000 years avoiding. Another transmission flickered across the display. This one internal. Intercepted. Origin, Directorate Command Node. Destination, Fleet Command. Kaylee's opened it. The message was brief. Containment failure confirmed. Execute corrective action. No specifics. No strategy. Just an order. Kaylee's closed the transmission, his thoughts moving faster now, connecting pieces that had previously seemed unrelated. "The silence isolates," he said. "The fleets respond. They move through corridors that are no longer fully visible to us." Lyr nodded slowly. "And they're being watched." Kaylee's turned back to the main projection, his gaze settling on the Sol system once again. It remained unchanged on the surface. Stable. Quiet. Compliant. But now, with everything else shifting around it, that stability felt artificial. Constructed. Like a still point at the center of something far larger. "They wanted this," Kaylee said. Oer did not ask what he meant. She already understood. Humanity had accepted every restriction. Every limitation. Every condition designed to keep them predictable. And then they had stopped. Not resisted. Not rebelled. Stopped. 7 days of silence. 7 days of compliance. 7 days of something happening beneath the surface that the Directorate had not seen. Until it was too late. They're not reacting to us, Kaylee's continued. They're positioning us. The realization settled into place with quiet, irreversible certainty. The disappearing nodes. The altered timelines. The blind spots. The message. We see you now. Humanity had not been hiding from the Directorate. They had been shaping what the Directorate could see. Another alert pulsed. Closer. Much closer. A Directorate fleet, one of the largest, had just entered a corridor affected by the silence. Its signal degraded instantly. Not lost. Distorted. Fragments of communication flickered across the display, broken transmissions bleeding through the interference. Navigation systems not aligning. Stars wrong positions. This sector doesn't match. Then nothing. The fleet vanished from the network. Not destroyed. Not confirmed lost. Simply gone. Kaylee's felt the shift inside him complete. This was no longer a question of containment. Or even control. This was something else entirely. Something the Directorate had never encountered. A species that did not challenge power directly. A species that did not fight on expected terms. A species that changed the battlefield itself. Oar's voice broke the silence. They're not isolating space, she said. Kaylee's looked at her. They're isolating reality. The words hung there, impossible and undeniable. Because if the fleet had not been destroyed, if it had not been detected, if it had simply disappeared from everything the Directorate could perceive, then it had not been removed. It had been moved somewhere else. Somewhere outside the system. Outside the network. Outside the Directorate's reach. Another transmission appeared. Not internal. Not external. Unknown. Kaylee's opened it immediately. The same human figure appeared, calm as before, but this time the background was different. Not soul. Not any recognized system. Stars arranged in unfamiliar patterns. Distances that did not align with known coordinates. A place that did not exist within the Directorate's mapped reality. The figure regarded them in silence for a moment. Then spoke. You built a system where everything has to pass through you. The pause. Just long enough to force attention. So we built one that doesn't. The transmission ended. Kaylee's did not move. Because in that moment, the full weight of what humanity had done finally settled into place. They had not broken the Directorate's control. They had stepped outside of it. And now, the Directorate was trying to fight something it could not see, could not track, and could not even define. The only question that remained was, how far had humanity already gone beyond them? For 40,000 years, the Directorate had believed a single, unshakable truth. Everything that existed could be mapped. Every star catalogued. Every system indexed. Every civilization tracked, studied, and ultimately understood. Knowledge was not just power, it was structure. It was control. It was certainty. And now, that certainty was gone. Not broken. Replaced. Kaylee's Varn stood motionless as the last transmission faded from the display, but his mind was no longer trying to contain the situation. It was trying to redefine it. They didn't breach the system, he said slowly. Oer Ven watched him carefully. No, she replied. They bypassed it. The distinction mattered. A breach implied confrontation. Resistance. A visible struggle between opposing forces. Bypassing meant something else entirely. It meant irrelevance. Kaylee's turned back to the projection, his gaze sweeping across the fractured network. The Directorate structure still existed. Its fleet still moved. Its systems still processed data. But all of it now felt incomplete. Like a map missing entire continents. Show me the affected regions again, he ordered. The system complied, highlighting the corridors of silence, the vanished fleets, the rewritten timelines. But this time, Kaylee's did not focus on what was missing. He focused on what remained. The unaffected nodes. The stable systems. The areas where the Directorate still had full visibility. He overlaid them with the anomalies. And then he saw it. They're not removing us from space, he said. They're removing space from us. O'Wyer's eyes narrowed slightly. Explain. Kaylee's expanded the projection further, pushing beyond standard resolution limits, forcing the system to display raw spatial data instead of processed coordinates. The result was disorienting. Stars shifted. Distances warped. Positions that should have been fixed began to drift under closer scrutiny. What we're seeing, Kaylee's continued, is not the actual structure of space. O'Wyer's attention sharpened. It's the structure we've imposed on it. For the first time since the anomalies began, something resembling understanding flickered across her expression. The network, she said. Kaylee's nodded. The Directorate doesn't observe reality directly. It observes a model. A framework built over millennia, refined, stabilized, and treated as absolute. And humanity, I began. Never accepted the model, Kaylee's finished. Silence filled the chamber again, but this time it was not empty. It was full of implications. Because if the Directorate's perception of the galaxy was based on a constructed framework, and humanity had found a way to step outside of that framework, then everything the Directorate believed it controlled was, at best, an approximation, or an illusion. Another alert pulsed across the display. Not a loss. Not a disappearance. An emergence. Kaylee's isolated it immediately. A signal. Faint. Unstable. Origin. Unknown. Coordinates. Undefined. The system struggled to render it, attempting to anchor it within known spatial parameters, but the signal resisted, shifting, slipping through the mapping algorithms like something that refused to be pinned down. Magnify, Kaylee's ordered. The projection adjusted. The signal expanded. And then slowly it resolved. Not into a system. Not into a fleet. But into something else. A structure. Vast. Complex. Impossible. It existed in a configuration that did not align with known spatial geometry, its form folding in on itself in ways that defied conventional perception. Layers of energy and matter intertwined, creating something that was neither entirely physical nor entirely abstract. Kaylee's felt a rare, unfamiliar sensation tighten in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. They've built it, he said quietly. Elware stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the impossible structure. Built what? Kaylee's did not look away from the projection. A parallel network. The words carried a weight that was difficult to fully grasp. Because the Directorate's network was not just infrastructure. It was reality as far as the galaxy understood it. And humanity had just created something beyond it. Another transmission followed immediately. This one clearer. Stronger. Origin. The structure. Kaylee's opened it. The same human figure appeared again, but now the difference was undeniable. They were no longer standing within the known galaxy. Behind them stretched something vast and unfamiliar, a landscape of stars arranged in patterns that did not exist within the Directorate's maps, connected by luminous pathways that pulsed with coordinated motion. A network, but not the Directorate's. This is what you couldn't see, the figure said calmly. No hostility. No urgency. Just quiet certainty. You built your system to observe everything that fits inside it. The pause. And you assumed that meant everything. Kaylee said nothing. O'Wyer did not move. Because neither of them had an answer. The figure continued. We didn't break your control. Another pause. Subtle. Deliberate. We stepped outside of it. The projection behind them shifted slightly, revealing more of the structure. Not just human constructs. Other signals. Other presences. Faint. But they're... Kaylee's mind locked onto that detail instantly. They're not alone, he said. O'Wyer's expression tightened. Those signatures... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Because they recognized them. Old patterns. Ancient. Familiar. 17 of them. The species the Directorate had integrated. Contained. Stabilized. Erased. Except now. They weren't gone. They were here. The human figure watched them for a moment longer, as if allowing the realization to fully take hold. Then they spoke again. You thought you ended them. The words were soft. But they hit with the force of something much larger. We found them. The transmission cut. Kayleigh stood in silence, the projection still glowing in front of him, the impossible structure lingering in his vision. For 40,000 years, the Directorate had believed it had shaped the galaxy, guided it, controlled it. But now, in a single moment, that belief had been dismantled. Not through force, not through war, through absence, through silence, through a simple, devastating truth. They had never seen the whole picture. Elwire's voice broke the stillness. If they've built a network outside ours. Kayleigh's finished the thought, his voice quieter now. Then everything we've done. He didn't complete the sentence. He didn't have to. Because the implication was clear. The Directorate had not been containing threats. It had been isolating itself. And now, for the first time in its history, it was no longer the center of anything. Another alert pulsed across the display. But this one was different. Not a loss. Not a signal. A shift. Across multiple sectors, systems that had been stable for centuries began to change. Communication patterns altered. Energy signatures fluctuated. Populations moved. Not chaotically. Deliberately. Kayleigh's watched as the network adjusted, trying to compensate, trying to maintain control. But it was too slow. Too rigid. Too bound to a model that no longer applied. They're expanding, Thayer said. Kayleigh's nodded. Yes. But not within the Directorate system. Beyond it. Through it. Around it. The silence had not been an absence. It had been a doorway. And humanity had just opened it. The only question left was, what happens when the rest of the galaxy starts walking through? The Directorate responded the only way it knew how. It escalated. Across thousands of systems, dormant protocols awakened with cold precision. Containment directives activated. Communication channels tightened. Entire regions were locked under surveillance density levels that had not been used in millennia. Fleets that once symbolized order now moved with singular purpose, converging along the fractures spreading through the network. Control was not slipping. It was being forced. Kayleigh's Varn watched it unfold without illusion. The Directorate was no longer analyzing the situation, it was reacting to it. And reaction, he understood with quiet certainty, was already too late. They're trying to close the gaps, Nor said, her voice steady but quieter than before. Kayleigh's nodded once. They don't understand what the gaps are. Because the corridors of silence were no longer empty. They were active. Where the network lost visibility, something else gained presence. Signals flickered in and out along the edges of perception, not conforming to known formats, not aligning with any recognized communication structures. They weren't noise. They were conversations. Just not ones the Directorate could hear. Redirect all long-range sensors into raw acquisition mode, Kayleigh's ordered. The system hesitated. That hesitation was becoming familiar. Processing capacity will be exceeded, it responded. Do it. The projection shifted violently, shedding layers of filtered interpretation as raw data flooded the chamber. Stars no longer appeared fixed. Space no longer behaved predictably. Distances stretched and collapsed depending on the angle of observation. It was disorienting. It was closer to the truth. And within that distortion, Kayleigh saw it. Movement. Not of fleets. Not of weapons. Of connections. Luminous pathways, faint but undeniable, threading through regions the Directorate had marked as empty. They intersected, diverged, reformed, constantly adapting, constantly shifting, forming a structure that did not rely on fixed coordinates. A network that did not need space to remain connected. They're not expanding through territory, Kayleigh said quietly. They're expanding through access. Elwire's gaze followed the pathways, her expression tightening as more of them became visible. And every time we lose visibility, she added, they gain another route. The implications were immediate and devastating. The Directorate controlled systems. Humanity controlled pathways between them. And pathways, Kayleigh's realized, were what truly mattered. Another alert surged across the display. Multiple fleet disruptions detected. Kayleigh's isolated the reports instantly. 3 enforcement fleets had entered silence corridors within the last 12 minutes. All 3 had ceased coordinated communication. Fragments of data filtered through, distorted, incomplete. Navigation, no reference points. We're not where we should be. This space, it doesn't behave. Then silence. Not disappearance. Not destruction. Displacement. They're not losing fleets, Ar said, her voice low. They're being redirected. Kaylee's understood. The Directorate's fleets moved according to mapped space, fixed coordinates, predictable trajectories, known distances. But those maps were based on the Directorate's model. A model humanity had just proven was not absolute. They're walking into a space we don't control, Kaylee said. And once they're inside, Ar added, they're no longer in our system. Another transmission flickered across the projection. Not from Sol. Not from the unknown structure. From within a silence corridor. Unstable. Distorted. Kaylee's opened it. For a moment, nothing resolved. Then an image struggled into form. A Directorate vessel. Damaged. Not by weapons. By disorientation. The stars outside its viewport twisted in unfamiliar patterns, constellations that did not exist within any known chart. The crew moved with visible confusion, their instruments displaying conflicting data, their systems unable to reconcile what they were detecting. One of them turned toward the recording device, their expression strained. "This isn't a void," they said. Their voice trembled, not with fear, but with something far more unsettling. "It's structured." The transmission collapsed. Kaylee's closed it slowly. The Directorate had spent 40,000 years mastering space. But space, it seemed, was not what they thought it was. "They built it without us," Or said. Kaylee's corrected her. "They built it around us." Because the Directorate's network still existed. It still functioned. But now it was surrounded by something larger. Something more flexible. Something that did not need control to operate. Another wave of alerts surged through the system. This time, not from fleets. From civilian regions. Entire populations were shifting. Not fleeing. Moving. Trade routes altered spontaneously. Communication hubs rerouted traffic without authorization. Isolated systems began establishing connections that bypassed Directorate channels entirely. "They're finding it," Or said. Kaylee's felt the weight of that realization settle in fully. Not just humanity. Others. Species that had lived under the Directorate structure for centuries were beginning to sense the change. To notice the gaps. To follow the pathways that appeared where none should exist. "They don't need to understand it," Kaylee said. "They just need to use it." And once they did, the Directorate's control would not just weaken. It would fragment. Because control required centralization. And humanity had just introduced decentralization on a galactic scale. Another transmission appeared. This one stable. Origin, unknown network. Kaylee's opened it immediately. The human figure appeared once more, but now they were not alone. Behind them, faint outlines resolved. Shapes, silhouettes, presences that carried the signatures of species long believed contained, diminished, or gone entirely. They were watching. Waiting. The human spoke. "You're trying to fight this like it's a territory." A brief pause. "It isn't." Kaylee said nothing. Because he already knew. "This isn't a war over space," the figure continued. "It's a shift in how space works." The projection behind them pulsed, the luminous pathways brightening as if responding to the statement. "You built a system where everything flows through you." Another pause. "So we built one where nothing has to." The transmission ended. Kaylee stood in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down with a clarity that could no longer be ignored. The Directorate was deploying fleets into a battlefield that did not exist in the way they understood. It was enforcing control over systems that were no longer dependent on its structure. It was reacting to a threat that was not trying to destroy it. It was trying to replace it. Or's voice broke the silence. "What happens when they stop needing us entirely?" Kaylee's did not answer immediately. Because for the first time, the question did not feel theoretical. It felt inevitable. Another alert pulsed across the projection. Not a fleet. Not a system. The core network itself. Latency spikes. Synchronization errors. Minor. But spreading. Kaylee's gaze hardened. They've reached the center, he said. I looked at him. The core. Kaylee's nodded. Yes. And if the core began to fail, the directorate would not fall slowly. It would collapse. The only question left was, how much of it was already gone? The directorate had never faced collapse. Not because it was invulnerable, but because collapse had never been allowed to begin. Every instability had been corrected before it could propagate, every deviation contained before it could spread, every threat neutralized before it could mature. That was the foundation. That was the certainty. And now, for the first time in its history, that certainty was breaking. Not in the outer systems. Not at the edges where control was weakest. At the center. Kaylee's Varn stood in the monitoring chamber as the core network began to stutter, not visibly, not catastrophically, but subtly, in ways that only someone like him could recognize. Timing discrepancies. Micro delays between synchronized nodes. Processes completing out of sequence. The kind of errors that should not exist in a system designed to eliminate them. They're not attacking the core, Ar said, her voice quieter now, as if speaking too loudly might make the realization more real. They're changing how it behaves. Kaylee's nodded. Because that was the difference. An attack would have triggered defense protocols. This was adaptation. The network was being forced to reconcile two incompatible realities at once, the rigid, centralized model it had always operated under, and something else that did not follow those rules. Something fluid, decentralized, unbound. They're making the system doubt itself, Kaylee said. And doubt, within a structure built on absolute certainty, was not a weakness. It was a fracture. Across the projection, the signs intensified. Entire sectors began desynchronizing, not losing connection, but failing to agree on what they were connected to. Data packets looped endlessly between nodes that could no longer establish consistent reference points. Fleet commands were issued, received, and then contradicted by subsequent transmissions that arrived out of sequence. The directorate was still functioning, but it was no longer unified. And unity had always been its strength. Another alert pulsed, this one sharper, more immediate. Core command relay desynchronization detected. Kaylee's isolated it instantly. The primary command node, the one responsible for coordinating the directorate's highest-level decisions, was no longer aligned with the rest of the network. It was receiving data. It was processing it, but the outputs no longer matched the inputs. It's splitting, OIR said. Kaylee's did not respond immediately, because what she had said was not entirely accurate. It wasn't splitting. It was being given a choice. For the first time, the directorate system was encountering multiple valid states of reality, and it could not resolve them into a single, authoritative version. Because no single version existed anymore. Another transmission appeared. Not external. Internal. From a command node. Kaylee's opened it. The message was fragmented, but the meaning was clear. Directive conflict, unable to resolve, multiple state validity, requesting override. Another followed. Control hierarchy unstable, authority chain compromised. And another. Consensus failure. Kaylee's closed the transmissions, his mind moving rapidly through implications that no longer fit within the framework he had relied on for centuries. The directorate was not being overpowered. It was being outgrown. The system they had built, perfect, controlled, absolute, was encountering something it could not absorb, could not categorize, could not reduce to a manageable variable. Humanity had not broken the system. They had introduced a new one. And now the old one was trying, and failing, to coexist with it. They're not forcing collapse, OR said. They're letting it happen. Kaylee's finally turned to her. Yes. Because collapse, in this case, was not destruction. It was transition. Another alert surged across the projection. This one massive. System-wide. Kaylee's gaze snapped back to the display. A broadcast. Not from the directorate. Not from the hidden network. From everywhere. Simultaneous. Unavoidable. Every node that still functioned, every system that still processed data, every channel that still carried information. All of them lit up at once. Kaylee's opened it. The image resolved instantly. The same human figure stood at the center, but now there was no ambiguity. They were not speaking from outside the directorate system. They were speaking through it. Behind them, the luminous pathways of the parallel network extended outward, intersecting with the directorate structure, weaving through it, around it, beyond it. And within those pathways, the silhouettes had become clear. 17. No longer faint. No longer hidden. Present. Watching. The human's voice carried across the entire network. Measured. Unavoidable. For 40,000 years, they began, you built a system that decided what the galaxy was allowed to become. No anger. No accusation. Just a statement. You didn't destroy potential. The pause. You redirected it. Kaylee's felt something tighten in his chest. Because that was true. The directorate had never framed its actions as destruction. It had been guidance. Stability. Control. But now, hearing it spoken like this, stripped of its justification, it sounded different. You isolated anything that didn't fit your model, the human continued. And then you called it order. The projection shifted slightly, revealing more of the network. Both of them. The directorate's rigid structure. Humanity's fluid one. Overlapping. Contrasting. Incompatible. We didn't come here to destroy that, the human said. Another pause. Deliberate. We came to show everyone there was another option. Across the network, responses began to ripple. Not commands. Not directives. Reactions. Systems that had been silent for centuries began transmitting independently. Civilian networks bypassed directorate channels entirely. Entire populations, long accustomed to a single flow of information, suddenly had access to something else. Kaylee's watched it happen in real time. Not chaos. Not rebellion. Something far more dangerous. Awareness. They're not taking control, R whispered. They're removing the need for it. Kaylee's did not answer. Because he could see it now. The directorate's power had never come from force alone. It had come from being the only system that worked. The only framework that connected everything. The only structure that made sense of the galaxy. And now, it wasn't the only one anymore. The human figure looked directly into the projection. Into him. We're not asking you to surrender, they said. Another pause. This one heavier. We're asking you to stop deciding for everyone else. The transmission held for a moment longer. Then quietly it ended. The chamber fell into silence again. But this silence was not empty. It was full of something that had never existed within the directorate before. Uncertainty. Not about what was happening, but about what came next. Kaylee stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the projection as the two networks continued to overlap, to interact, to reshape the structure of everything the directorate had ever known. For the first time in his existence, he was not looking at a problem to be solved. He was looking at a system he could not control. And somewhere within that realization, a final question began to form. Not about humanity. Not about the network. But about himself. If the directorate no longer defined the galaxy, then what did? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? For the first time in 40,000 years, the directorate did not issue a command. It waited. That alone would have been unthinkable only hours before. The system had always responded, immediately, decisively, without hesitation. Delay was inefficiency. Uncertainty was instability. Waiting was failure. But now, waiting was the only thing left that still made sense. Kaylee's Varn stood at the center of the monitoring chamber, watching the projection that no longer resembled anything he had known for most of his existence. The familiar lattice of control, orderly, hierarchical, absolute, still existed, but it was no longer dominant. It was surrounded, threaded through by something fluid, adaptive, alive in a way the directorate system had never needed to be. And the most unsettling part was not that it was stronger. It was that it worked. Across the galaxy, the shift continued, not violently, not chaotically, but with a quiet inevitability that could not be reversed. Systems that had once relied entirely on directorate channels began rerouting their communications, not in defiance, but in discovery. Civilian networks expanded into pathways that did not require permission. Trade, data, coordination, everything that had once flowed through a single controlled structure, now had alternatives. Not forced. Chosen. Kaylee's observed it all with a clarity that felt almost detached. Because for the first time, he was not trying to stop it. He was trying to understand it. "They're not dismantling us," Ar said softly, standing beside him. Kaylee's nodded. "No. Because dismantling would have required conflict. And conflict would have given the Directorate something to respond to. Something to fight. Humanity had not given them that. Instead, they had done something far more precise. They had made the Directorate unnecessary." Another series of updates streamed across the projection. Enforcement fleets, those that remained within the Directorate's mapped space, had halted their advance. Not due to damage. Not due to command failure. They had stopped because their targets were no longer where they were supposed to be. The corridors of silence were no longer just pathways. They were exits. And systems were beginning to use them. "They're leaving," Thor said. Kaylee's watched as entire sectors adjusted their positions within the network, not physically, but functionally. They were still where they had always been. But they were no longer where the Directorate expected them to be. "They're choosing where they exist," he replied. And that was the final break. Because the Directorate had never controlled space itself. It had controlled how space was understood. And now, that understanding was no longer singular. Another transmission appeared. Kaylee's opened it without hesitation. The human figure stood once more, but the presence behind them had changed. It was no longer just the 17. There were more now. Not fully visible. Not fully formed. But present. Species that had begun to step into the network humanity had created. Some cautiously. Some uncertain. Some with a quiet, growing confidence. They were not being led. They were joining. "You're still here," the human said, their tone unchanged, steady, almost conversational. Kaylee's did not respond. He simply watched. "We expected you to fight harder," the human continued. A slight pause. "But you're starting to see it." Kaylee's finally spoke. "You didn't destroy the system," he said. "No. You didn't take control." "No." Kaylee's gaze sharpened. "Then what exactly did you do?" The human regarded him for a moment, as if considering how much to say. Then they answered. "We gave everyone a way out." The simplicity of it was almost insulting. Almost. But Kaylee's understood. Because that was all it had ever taken. The Directorate had not needed to control every action. It had only needed to control the options. Limit the paths. Define the outcomes. And humanity had just undone that. Not by forcing a new order. By removing the old one's exclusivity. The projection behind the human shifted, revealing more of the network, connections forming in real time, pathways expanding, systems linking together in ways that no centralized authority could predict or regulate. "This isn't our system," the human said. Another pause. "It's everyone's." Kaylee's felt something shift inside him again, but this time it was not irritation, not realization, not even resistance. It was acceptance. Not of defeat, but of change. For 40,000 years, the Directorate had believed it was maintaining balance. Preserving order. Protecting the galaxy from itself. But now, looking at what was unfolding, Kaylee saw something he had not allowed himself to consider before. The galaxy had never needed protection from growth. It had needed the freedom to reach it. Another update flashed across the projection. Core network stabilization, partial. Not because the Directorate had regained control, but because it had stopped trying to enforce it where it no longer applied. The system was adapting. Slowly. Reluctantly. But undeniably. "They're not replacing us," Or said. Kaylee's nodded. "They're forcing us to evolve. Or disappear." The choice, for the first time, was not predetermined. The human figure watched him, as if sensing the shift. "We're not your enemy," they said. The pause. "But we're not something you can contain either." Kaylee's almost smiled. "Almost. I see that now." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Kaylee's did something the Directorate had not done in its entire history. He did not issue a command. He made a decision. "Open the network," he said. OIR turned to him. Not surprised. Just attentive. "To what extent?" she asked. Kaylee's looked at the projection, at the two systems no longer separate, no longer competing, but beginning to overlap in ways that neither had been designed for. "To all non-critical systems," he replied. "Remove enforced routing restrictions. Allow independent pathway selection." OIR held his gaze for a moment longer. Then nodded. The system hesitated. One last time. Then complied. Across the galaxy, something subtle but profound shifted. Barriers that had existed for millennia dissolved. Not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, like doors that had simply been unlocked. The Directorate did not fall. It changed. And in that change, something new began to take shape. Not a single authority. Not a single network. But something larger. More complex. More alive. Kaylee's watched as the projection stabilized, not into the rigid structure he had always known, but into something dynamic, constantly shifting, constantly adapting. For the first time, it felt incomplete. And for the first time, that did not feel like failure. It felt like possibility. The human figure inclined their heads slightly. Not in victory. Not in dominance. In acknowledgement. Then the transmission ended. The chamber fell silent one last time. But this silence was different from the one that had started it all. It was not empty. It was open. Kaylee's Varn stood at the center of a system that no longer revolved around him, and for the first time in his existence, he did not try to pull it back into place. He simply watched. Because somewhere beyond the boundaries of what he had once believed was everything, humanity had done something no force, no empire, no authority had ever achieved. They had not conquered the galaxy. They had changed how it worked. And the most dangerous part was, they had only just begun.